Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Plastic Jesus in the Pews, preparing for Earth Day Sunday. It's great to have you here, evening or afternoon or morning, wherever you're tuning in from. Thanks for joining us here today. And I hope you enjoyed that opening song. That was a song written in community specifically for Creation Justice Ministries and this Plastic Jesus resource that was performed by Andrew Moran and Randy Flowers. And it is available for use by you as part of any Earth Day Sunday events you might be doing. My name is Avery Davis Lamb, and I'm a co-executive director at Creation Justice Ministries, and I want to personally welcome you to our event tonight. The mission of Creation Justice Ministries is to educate, equip, and mobilize Christians and Christian institutions to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. Before we start tonight, I just want to share a few housekeeping things for our time together. The first is please introduce yourself in the chat if you have not yet. It looks like folks are underway with that. But please let us know who you are, where you're coming in from, your congregation, your congregational setting, if you are in one. We will have a Q&A panel at the end of our program today. So throughout the program, please, I invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to send in questions. We'll be collecting questions there and sharing those with the panel. Please don't put questions in the chat because sometimes the chat can get very lively and I may not be able to capture any questions that are in the chat. So please make sure to put those in the Q&A function instead. As you all may have noticed as you came in, this program is being recorded. We will put it up on our YouTube channel and send it out to all of our participants via email next week. So if you want to share this with anyone in your community, or if you want to watch it again, if there's a part of it that you want to check out, then it will be available starting next week. Today's program is an introduction to this year's Earth Day Sunday resource from Creation Justice Ministries, Plastic Jesus, Real Faith in a Synthetic World. This resource, which is available for free and download on our website, is designed to help congregations think more deeply about the ways the plastics impact our lives and impact God's creation. It's also intended to equip people of faith and communities of faith to take actions to address the plastic epidemic in faithful and practical ways. Inside the resource, you'll find stories of individuals and communities making a positive impact, stories like Zero Waste Church in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the Alaska Community Action on Toxins Project in Alaska. You'll find sermon starters to spark meaningful discussions in your church, which we'll hear more about from Derek later, worship resources like prayers, liturgies, and songs to unite in prayer and reflection, and many actionable steps at the individual, community, and advocacy level to help address the plastics crisis in our world. Our hope for this resource and for this event is that it will inspire work throughout our year, not just on Earth Day. Yes, talk about Plastic Jesus on Earth Day, but also talk about it beyond Earth Day. It's a resource that's designed to be used in any season, not just Earth Day Sunday at the end of April. Certainly, there are texts that are connected to the lectionary cycle and the lectionary that comes up on April 21st. But we also want this to be a way to engage in plastics education and advocacy throughout the year. So we've tried to construct it in a way so that it could be used for a Bible study or for a sermon series or whatever way makes sense for your community. So we hope that our time here together and your time exploring the resource after this will be helpful as you start to think about what Earth Day Sunday worship at your community might look like and think about the steps for caring for God's creation even beyond April 21st. With that, I'm pleased to get going in the program and to introduce our first speaker today, who is a friend and partner of Creation Justice Ministries. Liz DeMatti is going to share with us a little bit about background on the plastics crisis, especially as it pertains to our oceans. Liz is an ecologist at the Nicholas School of the Environment, and she is based at the Duke University Marine Lab. She's interested and an expert on the intersection of science and community. She's working on issues of plastic pollution education from a marine debris perspective, which she'll share with us today, as well as a storm water and microplastic perspective. Liz has been an amazing community partner with Creation Justice Ministries. For the past 3 years, we've been able to co-host retreats with her at Duke University Marine Lab, bringing scholars and faith leaders together. And we're absolutely delighted to have her on here to share her expertise with us today. So please join me in welcoming Liz.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for such a sweet introduction, Avery. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is an issue that is near and dear to my heart, as well as the Duke University Marine Lab. So I am excited to be working or here with you all today and sharing. When Avery asked me, I'm going to share my screen here and then also hit play. When Avery asked me to talk today, I thought, okay, how can I talk to a group of folks and give them a PowerPoint presentation, but also have resources on there where they can, after this, 5 or 10 minutes is done, go back over time and look and kind of dig deeper if they want to. So that's my goal today. You'll see some graphs, you'll see some infographics, but hopefully what you'll get at the end is kind of this view of why ocean scientists in particular think that the plastic crisis is alarming, but also why everyone, regardless of where you live or how far you live from an ocean, should think it is important. And so with that, I'm going to talk to you today about plastic pollution, otherwise known to many as marine debris. And I put this out because when you look at NOAA, so the National Oceanographic Administration Association, when you look at their definition, marine debris is defined as any persistent solid material that is manufactured or processed directly or indirectly, intentionally or unintentionally disposed of or abandoned into the marine environment of the Great Lake or the Great Lakes. And why that's important is that when they came up with this definition, there were folks who wanted them to say plastic pollution. But there was huge pushback because, it's not only plastics that are polluting our oceans or that are coming into our oceans and creating this convergence zone and in our oceans. But the big difference here, and one that we're going to kind of talk about today, is what happens with plastics. And so what happens with plastics is that they build up. And this is a resource here from the Ocean Conservancy. And it's an infographic that basically talks about there's 2.5 billion metric tons of solid waste produced all around the world. And I'm giving you, these are 2010 numbers. So these come from research done by Gemma Jambeck down in Georgia. This has her work and her colleagues' work have some of the most robust studies of how much is on our Earth. Remember, all of this is before COVID. At that time, 2.5 billion are produced around the world. 275 million of that is plastic waste. And 2 billion people live within 30 miles of the coast, which means that so much of that ends up in our coastal plastic waste. And of that, about 8 million metric tons into the ocean. And I have another infographic here. This is the same kind of format, but just in a different way of showing to you, because some people like bar graphs and others, but this idea of how much we're producing on land and how it moves into the ocean. And okay, 2.5 million metric tons, that's not that much, but consider this. We care about this because when things get into the ocean, what happens to them? If they're organic materials, they biodegrade. Our insects, bacteria, fungi will break it down into our basic organic components, and they break it down and it becomes soil or it becomes little organic pieces. Metals can corrode. So you have a gradual destruction of materials by chemical or electrochemical reaction. But then you have this other option, which is photodegradation. And that is when sunlight breaks something up into smaller pieces. And this becomes very important because plastics do not biodegrade. Petrochemical plastics break up into smaller pieces. They do not break down. And that photodegradation is then why marine debris and microplastics become such a big deal. So, this huge problem of plastics, widespread use by the 1950s. By 2015, we have 322 million metric tons produced per year. Remember, before COVID, that's our number. That is the total weight of the human population produced in plastic per year. And I say that because someone tells me how much something weighs, and you can say 322 million metric tons per year, and I don't have a good brain for that. But when you say, okay, the total weight of the human population produced in plastic per year, that makes me pause. And this is obviously a much lower number than what we have now. And at that time, when all this is coming from Jambeck's research, the average person disposes of 50 kilograms of plastic. Plastics. Careful use of materials and kind of ways to get involved are on the Ocean Conservancy website. With several decades of plastic release into the environment, this is our beaches. Without beach cleanups, this is what we would see here in North Carolina all the time. And if you look at this closely, it's all single-use plastics. So kind of what is plastic and where did it come from? 1907, Leo Bakelin actually produced Bakelite. I knew this word because my mother had Bakelite jewelry that I used to play with. But the word plastic comes from plastikos, which is the Greek word meaning moldable. And you mix phenol and formaldehyde, use heat and pressure, and you get plastics. From 1907 to now, we have a worldwide $1 trillion industry. So when we think of why some of our smaller actions maybe don't make a dent, it's because there's a $1 trillion industry behind making sure that we continually produce plastics. Kind of graphically representation of this, 1950, it's made. You have this phase from the 50s till mid 90s where people are using, and now phase 3, which our use and the global production has just skyrocketed. And when we say plastic, we say single-use plastic. Many people always kind of bounce back and say, wait, there's really good uses of plastics and things. But we see that it's a problem, and we've been seeing that it's a problem. The first kind of in the 1950s, is when we first start to see that it is a problem in landfills and the oceans. By 1972, MARPOL has the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, because at first everyone thought, hey, we see all this plastic in the ocean, it must be coming from ships. In 1988, they had a complete ban of disposal of plastics at sea. But what we have come to realize over time is that the pollution and the plastics in our sea, which kind of is the basis of some of our food chains, actually is not coming from boats. 80% of the plastics in the ocean is coming from land-based sources. And of the amount of plastic produced, if you look at this graph, the blue and the orange are consumer items and packaging. That's single-use plastic. So 60% of the amount of plastic that's produced per year is used once and then thrown away. People think, oh, recycling, that's the magic word. You can never get, because of the way that plastic's made, when you recycle and you add heat, you not only get off toxic fumes, but it will never be of as strong as product in the secondary market as it was when it was first made. So 60% of what we're producing every single year is actually just things that we use once and throw away. And what we throw away does not always stay in a landfill. It ends up in our rivers and our streams and in our oceans. The oceans end up becoming the landfill of plastics. And this great graph here kind of goes through how much, like what is the size pieces that we're finding in a persistent marine pollutant. And what you can see is that the bigger the plastics, you have fewer pieces, they weigh more. But these microplastics that are small actually have many pieces. And those many pieces in that original song that Avery played, it talked about being in what we eat and in breast milk, and that's because of the way it's in our food chain. These are quick graphs here only to show you that over time, and this is seabird species, we see plastic ingestion. So not only what we're going to eat because if we eat fish, but also any of our marine birds or marine mammals, they are also ingesting plastics. And by 2010, the amount of animals in these studies actually had plastic in most of them. Same is true for sea turtle species. And this was a meta-analysis, so it was looking at over time, but it's the exact same trend of over time, more and more animals that get randomly sampled actually have plastic ingested. And this is just true now. Now that we have ways to look at microplastics here on the coast at the Duke Marine Lab, one of the marine biologists here, they were looking at cold stun turtles, so turtles that die naturally because of cold stun events. And when they did necropsies on the turtles, every single one had microplastics in its gut. They weren't dying of the microplastics, but they had it in their gut. And so this is kind of a depressing graph, but it just shows you that the size of plastics can be dangerous at any stage. So the macroplastics can deal with entanglements. The mesoplastics ingested, this is the gut of a bird, and you can see anything from lighters to other things that are in there. And then microplastics end up in the flesh and in the gut of the bacteria, the larvae, and the fish. And where this gets concerning from the idea in that first song about even mother's breast milk is that as top predators here, we have humans and orcas, we end up bioaccumulating plastics just like heavy metals can from the bacteria that can ingest it, then filter feeders to fish, to the birds, to the mammal, to any of the mammals, into anything that are the top predators. So we may feel like our plastic water bottles, that our single-use water bottles, are benign, but when that breaks up into small pieces, it ends up in our food systems and affecting our health. So that's my most depressing graph. But then I switch over to a little bit of hope here in that there are things that we can do. And this is a schematic from the same article that talks about the different ways. There's governance. We can talk about producers. We can talk about consumers, waste management, and research. There are ways many of our congregations can hit each one of these avenues, from research with citizen science, helping to understand where it's coming, to working with legislature, to kind of thinking about what are better materials to use as consumers, and then also waste management within our own lives. And so I urge you, as we kind of look through and you look through the resources from Creation Justice Ministries, you think about where can I make a difference? And making differences at many multiple levels actually can have more agency over time. And the last thing I'll show, which is shameful that I'm doing, but I'll do it anyway, is we have a citizen science project here at the Marine Lab, which is called Adopt a Drain. And it's where you monitor and remove plastics from storm drains in your area. It is a great way to get people to see the connection between single-use plastics, stormwater, and our waterways, but it also takes stuff that would be in our roads and plastics in our roads out of getting into our oceans, and it also has agency towards kids, for kids. All of this we do in schools and with connecting with youth. With that, I will kind of stop here because I think I had 10 minutes. I'm going to stop. Stop the share.
Thank you, Liz. My name is Derek Weston. I'm the Theological Education and Training Coordinator. Thank you, Liz, so much for that presentation. So grateful. Liz's time is limited, and so we wanted to make sure that before we do our big Q&A at the end, if there are any questions for Liz that anyone wants to ask now, we can go ahead and start that now. We have one question here in the Q&A. What do you do with plastics after they are collected? And I think that's one of those questions I think is burning for a lot of us when we hear a lot of kind of skepticism about what's going on with recycling. So what do you do with plastics after it's collected?
So right now, the best thing to do is make sure that they end up in a landfill. Very few plastics are actually recycled. If they can be recycled, do, but very few, we call it aspirational recycling, in that you put it in the recycling bin because you think that it's going to be recycled, but almost 90% ends up in our landfills anyway. So really making sure. We like to talk about the 4 R's instead of just reduce, reuse, and recycle. We add the fourth R, which is refuse. So start refusing single-use plastics. That's one of the biggest things. The more we refuse single-use plastics, the less there's a market for them. Mm. So really kind of working. And then if you were asking about what do you do with the plastics that you're collecting, like from the storm drain, those right. ones we actually put in the landfill. So to make sure that they are just out of the water and out of the ability to be part of the food chain.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, a question from Avery. The NC legislature passed a preemption preventing municipalities from passing bans on plastic bags. This is a common tactic used by conservative legislatures across the US. How can we fight against this and still make local legislative change?
That is a very difficult question because that was a local ban that came out in the Outer Banks here in North Carolina that was overturned at the state level. One of the things that you can do, the legislature uses data. So the way that they have used data, and the Trash-Free Seas, which is part of the Ocean Conservancy, as well as the NOAA Marine Debris Tracker, they have used those data of how much plastic is on our beaches and in our oceans as a way to pressure legislatures. Because it's so hard to get these global estimates. But if you can show what is happening in your town and in your area, it's much harder to think that that is a problem elsewhere instead of locally. We have a local high school here that's doing this type of research to convince the commissioners to actually make sure that every restaurant in the town actually has plastic-free to-go utensils. So having local ordinances in ways where you can circumvent sometimes helps. And then the more local ordinances that pop up, the more you can pressure some of the state and federal as it becomes a problem everywhere, not just in blue or red areas.
Yeah, thank you. Reminder for folks to put questions into the Q&A and not into the chat. That way it's easier for us to stay organized. We have a question here. Can you refer folks to a repository of materials describing plastics harm to human health? I think people are looking for like an easy resource that they could, where it's might be organized for them.
Yeah, and that is a hard one. Let me come back to you on that because I can't think of one where that would be off the top of my head right now. But I will get that. The hard part with this is that things like microplastics, while they're in things, it's correlative instead of causative. And so there was just recently papers talked about how much plastic chemicals are in those single-use plastic water bottles. and what that is probably doing to our gut biome and gut health. But these are long-term studies. Like, we're kind of living in this long-term study right now. And so it's hard to look at some of that. They have been showing, Dan Richoff here at the Marine Lab has looked at, like, when soft corals actually ingest plastic particles, they actually fully expel their zooxanthellae and stop photosynthesizing. So they lose and they wither. So, but some of that is because there's heavy metals in the coloring of the plastics, but also the amount of chemicals that are in plastics. It's really, it's not all uniform. And so it's hard to pinpoint what's causative and what is a correlation.
Yeah. I think that's really a helpful way of framing it, that we're still kind of in the midst of we're in the middle of the study. We're living through the study. I think you kind of touched on this, but I think it's worth revisiting again. The question is, why do they keep making plastics if they are recycled? And this is something in the horticulture industry saying they throw away thousands of plant containers. What to do about that?
And so part of this has to do with environmental economics and where we, sorry, I turned on this light because I was getting dark outside, and I now look like I have a funny hat on. But part of what it is there's externalities involved in that the people who actually create the plastic products are not taking the environmental cost. They don't pay the environmental cost. The global public is paying the environmental cost for that. So the externalities that exist with plastic production mean that they can sell you something that's made from a petrochemical at a very low price because they never pay for the global cost. And our waterways are a common pool resource, so we all use them. No one is really in charge of it, and no one can tell anyone else really what to do there. And the harm of the plastic is borne by us. It's not reflected in the cost of that plastic piece. So closing that loop of environmental externalities is huge, and that comes from kind of legal legal pressure, and then human pressure for policies as well.
Yeah. A couple more, then we'll let you go, Liz. Question about plastic in landfills and whether or not it breaks down and leaches into wastewater through wastewater treatment plants.
So that really depends on the landfill and how they're constructed. Yeah, and I'm not a groundwater expert, so I hate to say things, but there are very different how landfills are constructed, and what happens to the leachate is definitely something that is highly regulated in some areas and not so highly regulated elsewhere. So yeah, I think that's about where my knowledge ends there.
Yeah. Are reusable plastic water bottles any better than single-use ones?
So I think that's looking at two different costs. So one is just you would definitely, so a single use plastic water bottle takes hundreds of years to break up into small pieces. And so if you're using the same one over time instead of multiple ones, you're definitely decreasing the amount of plastic out there. If you're talking about human health and what's kind of leached into the water, what comes out, it's unclear. I personally use metal water bottles.
Yep, that's helpful. And then last question, how can we consider the possibility of change when companies continue to use plastics in their distribution channels?
So this is a hard one, and I think this is really where the power of people come in. And change is slow, but when more and more people demand it, and people from many different backgrounds start demanding it, change can happen. So it is one of those things that pressure, I think, from consumers is one of the things that will change things. When people start refusing single-use plastic, the market for it will decrease, but also legislation can help.
Yeah. Liz, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your information and thank you for your passion for the subject. I think one of the things that does help make a difference is people who are passionate about talking about these issues, and we appreciate that so much about you. So thank you for being with us tonight.
Oh, thank you. And if anyone wants to adopt a drain or be part of it, feel free to send an email.
Thank you, Liz.
Have a great night.
So Liz is absolute joy to work with, and we're so grateful to have her as a partner and as a friend, and so grateful for all the work that she does. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit. We've heard a lot of the science, but a lot of you are folks who are in churches, working in churches, and so we want to talk about theology here, and we want to talk a little bit about how we connect the theological dots. One of the things that was challenging for the staff and the resource committee as we were thinking about these issues is that, yes, plastic is ubiquitous in our world and in our culture, but plastic's nowhere in the Bible. So how are we going to talk about this from a theological perspective? What we came down on were a couple of things that are really about universal human human nature pieces, aspects of what it means for us to be humans and what it means for us to be followers of Christ. So yes, as Ellen Davis has said in conversation, we had the pleasure of having lots of conversations with Dr. Ellen Davis. She talks about the fact that we are living farthest from the biblical world, and that's both in terms of technology, but also in terms of our disconnection from nature. So recognizing, yes, we have that distance from the biblical world, but we also recognize that there are truths in the Bible that can help us understand these things. And one of them is the very basic notion of sin. So often when we talk about sin, we think of sin in terms of individual acts. And while sin certainly is that, I think it's helpful to recognize that sin more commonly in the Bible is thought of as a communal act, that we have communal sins in our culture. And so in our theological reflection that you'll find in the resource, we highlight two of those communal sins. One is idolatry, and really thinking about idolatry as anything that is made with human hands being in the place that God is supposed to be in our lives. And when we allow the convenience of our plastic items and our plastic gadgets to get in the way of actually being in communion with other people, being able to connect with other people, that is an idol for us. That has become a thing that is in the place of God. And then the other pretty obvious one is greed. And one of the things that we're seeing, particularly as cars become electrified, is that a lot of the fossil fuel industry is shifting from fueling vehicles to putting their resources into creating plastics. The fossil fuel industry is really driving the production of plastics in this country. And we have to recognize that that's about greed. We have to recognize that that's not about, we don't need plastics in the ways that it's being produced. We don't need single-use plastics. We don't need oranges in plastic wrappers. Oranges come with their own wrapper. We don't need those sorts of things. And so recognizing that there's greed involved in those sorts of things and being able to call out that greed as a sin that is existing in our society, that's incredibly important. So being able to talk about communal sins of idolatry and communal sins of greed, that is incredibly important as we're talking about plastic issues. One of the things that we talked about is the idea of enough. It's a concept that just really isn't talked about enough in our culture, is the idea of having enough. When we So oftentimes we see Philippians 4:13 and we see I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And we see that verse out of context. The context of that verse, which is so well known, the verse is well known, but the context is not. The context is Paul talking about the fact that he has learned contentment. He has learned contentment with having a lot. He has learned contentment with having a little. He is the superhuman feat that Paul is talking about is learning to know when he has enough, is learning that feeling of contentment and having enough. And that is one of those things that we need to learn in our culture, that we don't need more things, that we don't need more stuff, that we don't need to purchase every gadget and thing that's out there, particularly if it's something that future generations are going to deal with. And that kind of segues well into our third kind of theological theme, which is eternal life. We think about eternal life oftentimes as a good thing. And when Jesus talks about the gift of eternal life, it is a good thing. But we also now have this substance in our water and in our soil and in our bodies that scientists are telling us takes thousands and thousands of years to break down. That plastic kind of for all intents and purposes has an eternal life in our culture. And so one of the things that we have to think about in terms of what does it mean to love our neighbor? Oftentimes at Creation Justice Ministries, we think a lot about what does it mean to love our non-human neighbor, the trees, the animals, the vegetation that is around us, the waterways. Also want to think in terms of time and chronology, that we need to be thinking about loving our future neighbor. And our use of plastics right now is not loving our future neighbor. In fact, it's creating a burden that our future neighbor is going to have to bear. So thinking about ways that this kind of eternal life that can be in plastics can actually be not a positive, but a negative. And thinking about the ways that we reorient ourselves towards caring for our neighbor in the future. So to that end of thinking about theology, we wanted to give preachers some text to kick off some sermons that they may want to do in their context. And so we have 4 that we wanted to share with you as we kind of segue into thinking a little bit about how would we get to preaching about these topics. The first is the story of the golden calf. We all know the story of Moses going up the mountain, the people grumbling, being left at the base of the mountain and thinking that we need something that we can see, that we can touch, that is made with human hands, that being the thing that we worship. And that for us really felt like a really powerful metaphor for the role that plastics plays in our communities and in our culture at large, that we have created this thing with human hands that has become the center of our economy, and in a lot of ways that has become the center of the conveniences that we have in our life in so many ways, and that has become an idol for us, one that we have actually in some ways abandoned seeking after God for. So that is one. The next is thinking about Jesus's idea of abundant life that comes from John chapter 10. What does abundant life look like? Does abundance look like an abundance of things? Does it look like an abundance of stuff? Does it look like an abundance of items that can be purchased in the store? Or is abundant life about our relationships? Is it about our community? Is it about being in right relationship with God and God's creation? Is abundance really about the fact that God has created a world of abundance, and us being a part of ecosystems and being a part of the natural world is us being a part of an abundant life, the abundant life where there's more than enough for everyone and no one has to hoard. That's the kind of abundant life that we believe that Jesus is talking about, and that Jesus is pointing us to. The next passage that we, in terms of thinking about sermon starters, is Psalm 23. Psalm 23 is in the lectionary for the weekend of Earth Day. And it's amazing, this question of the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Again, it's bringing us to this idea of contentment, and as the psalmist describes this life of not wanting, so many of the images are of green fields, still water, of a good meal, of being in community with people, of being in community with nature. That the ideas that are brought about um, in that psalm are images of us being in right relationship with creation. They're images of sort of unspoiled nature, and I think in contrast, thinking about polluted waters instead of still waters, thinking about um, lands that are ruined and spoiled by the fossil fuel industry, thinking about all of these things are sort of opposite of this pastoral image that Psalm 23 calls us to. We're being called to walk in a different way. And then the final one that we used is the Tower of Babel, and one of our board members wrote this piece, recognizing when we think that technology is going to take us to a new place, that technology is actually going to bring us closer to the peak of human accomplishment, and that technology is going to create to solve all of our problems, and that technology is going to be the thing that allows us to be the best versions of ourselves. The story of the Tower of Babel actually puts the lie to that. And in fact, what happens and the result of that technology is that humans are divided. Humans are scattered from each other, and they're divided from God. And we think that this is another story, that as we think about the ways that these industries have pushed us away from each other, away from God, away from creation, but so often for the sake of what is told us as progress, we're really brought back to the fact that we have bought into a lie. We have bought into a lie of what we really need to be the fullest and best versions of ourselves. So those 4 texts are texts that are in the resource that you can use for sermon starters. Obviously, these are just ideas that we thought were helpful as we were thinking about this idea. And again, as we were thinking about the fact that, yeah, plastic itself is not in the Bible, but these kind of universal ideas that touch around the idea, the ways that we use plastics in our culture, in our lives, they're there. And we need not abandon theology when we are talking about these things. And we need not turn our back on the resources that our faith gives us when we're talking about these things, if we want to have real and lasting change. So from there, I want to invite 2 of our board members who were a part of the creation of this resource to join us for conversation. So Phoebe Chatfield, who is the Program Associate for Creation Care and Justice in the Episcopal Church wide. In that role, she encourages and celebrates Episcopal efforts towards environmental justice, sustainability, climate action, and racial reconciliation. And she lives in Somerville, Massachusetts, in the Boston area. And then Reverend Dr. Betty Holly. She serves as the senior presiding elder of the Cleveland District of North Ohio Conference, the third Episcopal District in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And Dr. Holly serves as the academic dean, director of the Master of Divinity degree program, and is the full tenure professor of ecological theology at Payne Theological Seminary, the oldest freestanding African-American seminary of the 6 historical Black seminaries in the United States. So the 2 of them, and Avery and I, are going to have a brief conversation. And at this point, again, want to encourage you to put questions into the chat because we want to, again, have some time for Q&A after our brief conversation. But I've been very keenly aware of the fact that I am coming up on my 1-year anniversary at Creation Justice Ministries, and pretty excited about that. But you all have some experiences that I don't have in terms of how the Earth Day resource from Creation Justice Ministries has been used in congregations. And so I would love to hear from you all how you've seen our Earth Day resource be a resource for congregations.
Well, Derek, I'd like to start being part of a global church, African Methodist Episcopal. We are in 39 countries and on 5 continents, and we have used these resources with our Christian Education Department to connect with our brothers and sisters overseas, and they look forward to it every year, because it's a new theme. So they look forward to it. That's a way to connect with them. Also, our women in ministry, we have used this resource to do retreats. We have retreats, at least one retreat every year with the whole connectional women in ministry, even our brothers and sisters in Africa, come together in one central place. And we use this resource to enlighten and help us to be aware of the kinds of things that we need to be aware of to spread the news of the particular topic. The seminary, we have had town hall style meetings around using this resource, which has really brought in an ecumenical flavor, not just AMEs. We've had several religions to come to our campus to talk about the kinds of things that's in these particular resources. And our young people, we've had them to put together drama series, put together plays, and this really helps them to really get involved and really understand it. And last, just want to say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So a lot of our young people will express themselves based on the theme using art. And we have like an art contest. So those are the kind of things that we have been able to use these great resources created by Creation Justice Ministries.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. And what a great way to get us started thinking about all of that. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Like Derek said, I work in the Episcopal Church, and I'm so glad that you said that, Dr. Holly, that there's a global aspect to this that's really important. And we know that the plastic that we produce, the pollution that we produce in one place doesn't follow, it doesn't stay within the human man-made borders, but actually travels around the world. And in the Episcopal Church context, we have Episcopal churches in 17 different countries, and we're also a part of a global Anglican communion, and have been finding that environmental issues and the urgency of addressing pollution and climate change really brings us together across a wide geography. All of the ideas you brought in for how to use this are fantastic. I think part of what the Earth Day Sunday resource from CJM offers each year is an influx of new ideas. And so if you're in a congregation that celebrates Earth Day every year, it's an opportunity to do something different. Maybe have this focus on plastic pollution if that isn't something that you've emphasized before. And I think there's also a wisdom in how it's put together and what makes a really strong creation care, creation justice event or series. It reminds us that it's important to have prayer. It's important to have storytelling, especially success stories, hopeful stories of examples of where churches and activists are making a difference on these issues. It's important to have some science and some learning so everyone leaves feeling like they understand these issues better. And it's important to have music or art, those things that really speak to our heart and connect to our tradition. So I would encourage you, as you're planning, however your congregation will celebrate Earth Day, to think about those different elements and how they could come together.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Holly and Phoebe. I'll just add in a couple pieces. I think our hope for this resource, like I said in my introduction, is that it kickstarts something at your congregation, or it's built into the work that you're doing around creation justice work. So I've heard of communities who have done a series based on the Earth Day Sunday resource. Like last year's on sowing seeds, so they did a series on agriculture and the climate crisis. So we encourage you to think beyond just Earth Day Sunday and how this might move forward the creation justice efforts in your congregation. The second thing, and Dr. Holly was touching on this a little bit, is just it's an ecumenical resource. And I've heard actually a lot of folks coming together, hosting an ecumenical Earth Day service in their town or in their city, because it's an opportunity for us to reach across our denominational lines and connect with something that really does connect us all, which is care for God's creation. So I think it's really, really helpful, especially for those ecumenical services.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I'm just kind of taking a pulse here. How much do you think churches are actually talking about plastic usage within the congregation or in the society? Like, how much do you think that's even a topic of conversation?
Well, I can speak for my denomination. We're not talking about it enough. We have quite a few things on our plate, and this resource will help us to look at the science of it and get familiar with that, and then look at how we are using the particular, like we have a lot of meet, greet, and eat situations. So this will help us to bring that paper plate or that paper straw. I'm just so excited when Starbucks started using paper straws, and other restaurants, because I mean it makes you, when you look at that straw, you think, oh my goodness, okay, this is good. I'm glad I'm here, drinking this coffee or whatever or drink. But I don't think we're talking about it enough. And so with this resource, we have something now in our hands, tangible, that we can share with the congregation to get the conversation started.
I'll pop in here too. I think that I've heard of a lot of churches that are interested in talking about plastics, and I have identified that plastics are a problem. But I think too often the conversation ends at recycling. And we've heard a lot today, and so many reports have come out in the last year that say that recycling is clearly not enough and it's not effective, and that we were misled, right? We didn't know. We were misled by the recycling industry, who convinced us, and the plastics industry, who convinced us that it was enough. And so that calls a different question for our congregations, many of whom have invested a lot of work in recycling over the years. So it's an opportunity to revisit all of the groundwork that has been paved around recycling efforts, and to say, okay, we did our best here, and now we need to do something different.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Avery, that there have been congregations, and I was really proud to see that Church of the Nativity in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Episcopal Church, their story is told in this resource. There are churches that have been kind of on the prophetic edge of talking about plastic pollution and embracing a mindset of how to get down to zero waste. But in many places, we haven't revisited those conversations enough, and we haven't brought in some of the elements that do come through in this resource, including that there's a justice aspect of all of this. We're learning more and more that plastic impacts all of our health, but it doesn't impact us equally, and that there are those communities, especially in places like Cancer Alley, which comes up in the resource, an industrial area near the Mississippi River. The communities are facing an overabundance of polluting industries, including plastics, and that they're facing really serious health impacts. So to talk about plastics actually as an issue of justice and of how all communities deserve a right to a healthy and clean place to live, I think that's an important piece that we could all be talking about more.
Yeah. I want to get to the for the sake of time, I want to go to the Q&A box here because there's some good questions. One not a question but a comment is that EPR legislation can help, but it's hard to pass. And I wanted to draw attention to, so for those of you who don't know what EPR is, it's extended producer responsibility. And there is a clip on our website from it's actually there's a little clip and then there's a longer clip on our YouTube page on the UCC's resolution on plastics, where they talk about extended producer responsibility. And this is really about putting some of the responsibility on to the folks who are actually doing the damage, which are the fossil fuel companies, the folks who are doing the production of plastics. That legislation is incredibly hard to get passed, but I think first off, people need to know that that's an option, that EPR legislation is something that we can be fighting for. And if you are in one of the states, right now it's mostly happening in New England, but if you're in one of the states where EPR legislation is moving forward, support it and get others in your church and your communities to support EPR legislation, because if we get to a space where the folks who are doing the production are actually bearing some of the brunt, that's one of the ways that we can see some of these habits change. Did anyone else want to say anything else about EPR before we moved on? Okay. There's a question here of providing more examples of idolatry, and I think one of my kind of go-tos is when in doubt, quote Wendell Berry. And one of the quotes that we have in the resources from Wendell Berry saying, idolatry always reduces to worship of something made with hands, something confined within the terms of human work and human comprehension. And I think that can include the things that are made with plastic that can very much become idolatrous to us. But I think also ideas of achievement, ideas of accomplishment, ideas of progress. But then also I think just very simply profit as is a huge area of idolatry for us in our culture. So just wanting to name, I think there's a lot of ways that you can take this idea of idolatry and the idea of things that are made with human hands forward. But yeah, I think there's a lot of ways that you can go with that. So panel, I want to ask this question. With my demographic on Cape Cod, lots of seniors, they're all about this, but to get them to actually do something, thoughts? What do we do to empower our seniors and our community, or if a lot of our faith communities might be predominantly seniors? Like, what are some things that we can do to sort of motivate that particular demographic?
Yeah. I'll share something that I think is motivating for everyone, including seniors, which is getting involved with citizen science projects around plastic pollution, especially on Cape Cod. I have no doubt that there are, local universities, maybe in the Boston area, who have projects around Cape Cod that are studying marine debris off the coast and in the Gulf of Maine. And so I would just do a little research and see if there are opportunities to plug in with those citizen science projects. Because it's fun. Honestly, it often means going out on a boat. It means getting to see firsthand the effects of pollution, plastic pollution. And then, an opportunity to do something with the plastics that you create. So something that Liz does at the Duke Marine Lab is then they make plastic art. And it's a way of sort of turning something that is degrading into the environment into something beautiful. And it's a public piece that you could display in your community. that could also be an intergenerational activity, bringing together seniors and children to make that art together.
Others thoughts on how we engage, or maybe even kind of broadening this question, how do we engage intergenerationally on these issues?
Yeah, I think that's such a rich question on plastic and on so many of the creation justice issues that we face. I thought that the theological framing that you were offering, Derek, especially as it relates to the legacy that we're leaving behind, is a really powerful starting point for this conversation. And especially if there are people who have mobility challenges and can't participate in a in a beach cleanup or in some of those traditional activities that you might think of around plastic pollution, inviting people to write postcards that are advocacy, calling on your legislators to do more, or finding out if there are organizations in your town or community that are already tackling this problem and could use your help, whether that's offering them the use of your congregation to have their meeting, or offering to help support one of their existing campaigns. I think that this issue is a great chance to feel like you as your congregation don't have to reinvent the wheel and get this started, but can really start from a place of curiosity of wondering who else in our community is already getting started with this work.
And I also think that, a lot of our seniors are retired. They are looking for something to do. So, to be a part of what Phoebe mentioned would be wonderful. In fact, I remember one of our rehabilitation facilities. They were doing something on recycling, and they at that time, and they really got the persons that were in there, and a lot of them were immobile, and but they put their little bit in, and it became something that they looked forward to when they had like group activities, like during the day. It would be around something relative to one of the resources. And so with this particular resource relative to Plastic Jesus would be awesome for them.
Yeah, that's really helpful to point that out. And I do want to just one of the questions, because we're kind of at time, and want to be respectful of everyone's time. But one of the questions, and I had to do a little bit of research on this, is that there was a question about are we prioritizing talking about plastic over styrofoam? And technically, for all intents and purposes, styrofoam is a plastic in terms of its technical composition and all those sorts of things. So when we're talking about plastics, styrofoam is sort of lumped in there. So, but Phoebe and Dr. Holly, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for the work that you did on this resource and the work that you do for Creation Justice Ministries, and the work that you do in your own spheres on these issues, which are such a huge impact. So thank you.
Thank you. So great to have been with you tonight.
All right. Thanks so much to the panel. All right. And everyone join me in thanking the panel again and thanking our presenters, Derek, thanking Liz, who, as she said, had to leave a little bit early, but we'll pass along our gratitude to her. I know there's lots of love for Liz in the chat. We're going to do a few things before closing here, so we're not quite at closing time yet. But the first thing I want to do is invite you to our next webinar at Creation Justice Ministries. On March 21st, we are hosting an event called Holy Week in Liberation, Black Preaching in a Climate Crisis. This is going to be at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on March 21st, and it's co-hosted with our friends at the BTS Center and Lexington Theological Seminary. This program will welcome 3 preachers to share short homilies and conversations that move us through Holy Week while bringing messages of new life for all of creation. It should be a really cool, really beautiful event, and we'll hear some awesome preaching. So invite you to join that, a way to get inspired the week before Holy Week. I'm going to share a closing prayer in just a moment, and then we are going to close with another song that we had commissioned and recorded as a part of this resource, Creation is Waiting for Us. As I mentioned at the beginning, the songs that are in the resource are available for use at your congregation. They are copyrighted by Creation Justice Ministries and made for your distribution, so you don't need to license them. You can use the sheet music in any way that you like. So whether you like Plastic Jesus or our closing song, Creation is Waiting for Us, or any other one, we invite you to use those. As we move to close, please join me. I'll be reading the prayers of gratitude from Plastic Jesus. In the Word, 1 Thessalonians 5:16 through 18 reminds us to rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. We know there is much to be thankful for, even in our plastic crisis. We acknowledge that plastic is a useful resource when used appropriately, as in many life-saving medical applications. We can also give thanks for the many people leading the way in tackling the misuse of plastic and uniting to take action to be good stewards of your earth. Thank you, God, for organizations that fight tirelessly for the betterment of us all, organizations that honor Indigenous voices and wisdom as they do the crucial work of making connections between these dangerous impacts on the human, plant, and animal health and the fossil fuel-driven production of plastics. Thank you, God, for the thousands of people worldwide who take part in plastic-free efforts, reducing their own reliance on single-use plastic and encouraging others to understand the damage plastics are doing to creation and our global neighbors. Thank you, God, for the new global plastics treaty negotiations that are taking place during 2023 and 2024, and the opportunity to tackle our plastic crisis as a global community. Thank you, God, for people of faith for whom love of creation and care for God's world is a core piece of their identity and their faith in the Lord, and who are using their creative gifts to reduce reliance on plastics and encourage others to bravely go against the flow of society standards. The rising levels of plastic production that bring destruction to the oceans and their inhabitants deeply sadden us, and we recognize that it grieves our Creator. We give thanks for all the voices working and praying for the day that will bring real change. And the people of God say, Amen. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I encourage you, if you have time, to stay on and listen to our closing song, Creation is Waiting for Us.
Ice caps are holding the floodgates, melting with each passing day. Smoke from the wildfires burning, stealing our blue skies away. Business as usual mandates, profits mean more than the poor.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.